Instant classics are few and far between in gaming, but when they do come around, they make a lasting impact, both in how they are remembered and in the way they affect the games that succeeded. Welcome to a recent retrospective, where I take a look at a recent game whose influences are seen far and wide in the scope of gaming. I want to start by looking at one of the very best games on the PlayStation 3, and one of the greatest gaming stories ever told, The Last of Us. I will be looking back at what made The Last of Us so great, and how it is still widely prevalent in the minds of gamers, but more importantly, developers. In my view, The Last of Us is one of the greatest games ever made. So let's see what made it the perfect send-off to the PlayStation 3.
Whoa.
What?
First time on a boat.
Well, it's a little bit different in the water.
One step at a time.
There's something really special about the ability of a game to tell a story. Interactivity fundamentally changed how storytellers can portray their world because not everyone will have the same experience or be able to see the same things, especially when even linear games are upwards of a dozen hours to complete. Many games crumble under the interactivity lens, forcing players to play a certain way instead of rewarding them for going off the beaten path. This idea is one of the very best things The Last of Us does. Complementing an impeccable main story with additional unrequired stories that add to the world are how this game creates agency and allows the player to engage more fully while being able to tell a linear story. The most obvious and famous answer is that of Ish in the sewers, where we collect a series of notes from this group of people meeting for the first time, joining forces, and eventually running away when the infected invade their sewers. Without these notes, the story plays on, working its way through the sewers, fighting many infected and coming across vacated living areas. But with the context of the group that lived there, mystery arises. Did the infected kill the members? Did they escape? Am I killing these people? Though we do get some confirmation from a letter saying they were going to escape, the possibility looms. And the attachment that we've made with these characters we've never met, where the idea of killing their infected bodies is heart-wrenching, epitomizes the success of the smaller stories built into the world. This collection of half a dozen notes was even the subject of some discussion for the DLC, which shows how much we know about it to say there is a story to tell, yet how much is left to the imagination to say that we could play a 2-hour story filling in the details. This type of storytelling is found throughout the game, though in smaller individual stories, from diaries of children from the beginning of the outbreak to journals of lookouts waiting for supplies. These kinds of missable storytelling techniques can be seen in some character interactions and dialogue within the game, but many of these are completely unrequired. The relationship between Joel and Ellie is the centerpiece of this story, and yet many of the interactions that show their improvement is within gameplay. They will often make conversation in certain spots that Joel can walk away from, and Ellie will even say, "making progress," when they keep talking. This is a line that most games would put front and center because of its importance, but here it isn't vital because the main story does such a good job of telling that relationship, and this is just a small yet important addition to that scene which gives perspective on Ellie. Another key line you can skip is Ellie's famous "endure and survive," where after killing the checkpoint full of enemies, Joel and Ellie will talk for a while. And at the end, Ellie will say her famous phrase, "But you can miss it," and the later references will make less sense because of it. The final notable gameplay interaction is with Sam and Henry, where Ellie and Sam will play darts spontaneously, even though Joel can just leave if he wants. Even though that would show Ellie what the real world was like, if Joel chooses to stay with her, he gets to see and participate in a darts competition, which is followed by him and Henry commenting on how kids can no longer be kids.
There'll come a day where kids can just be kids again.
Let's go.
This is the kind of dialogue that adds to the scene without being vital to the story, and is one of my personal favorite scenes in the game. But the storytelling doesn't stop with collectible notes and interactions. The entirety of the game is a story when considering the environments. Because there is little context given about the 20 years between the outbreak and the game's story, we are left to fill in the blanks about what happened with all the decrepit buildings and abandoned quarantine zones. The game can lead us through these environments, but it's up to the player to put together how everything got to be the way it is. On a smaller scale, the same applies to smaller story-based areas. When Joel and Ellie enter Bill's house, there's a pile of questionable magazines on the table and a chapel in the building, and elsewhere, we find what appears to be a butcher workshop for the infected. All of these are easily overlooked, and they are up to the player to interpret. But they are the small details that culminate in these morally gray people and places. There is so much detail, and yet there is no definitive answer for most, if not all, of their morality and character. I can finish a segment of the game having gone through an entire city, building, or other location and still be able to decide how I feel about that place without the game making me feel one specific way. But some might be surprised to know that The Last of Us is a video game, and therefore has to become a game every once in a while. And surprise, it's fantastic and a shitload of fun. Yes, there's the infamous dumb AI not spotting Ellie when she walks right in front of them, but that's nitpicking when compared to the rest of the game. To start about the gameplay, you have to look at Naughty Dog's track record. Specifically, that is, look at Uncharted. You'd expect similar lightheartedness and relatively mild gore to continue for Naughty Dog, and that's pretty true. Okay, maybe not.
Shit, Joel.
But that maturity allows for entire new dynamics within the game. Everything is centered on the idea that anyone could die at any moment. Yeah, it's common in zombie games, but for once a game actually capitalizes on that tension. And it's not like many other games where you have the choice of how to play, but you breathe too loud and the entire fucking Russian military is on your back. Here you actually have the choice. The level design is so tight and well thought out that there are actually multiple ways of getting through most levels because they are so wide open. And what the action conveys is the ridiculous, sometimes over-the-top gore and brutality. It does not hold back, and is not afraid to show you some dude's head getting blown off, not even in a fucking E3 demo. But that brutality makes sense for the game. To use a word everyone hates, there's no ludonarrative dissonance here. You're gonna bash someone's head in with an upgraded wooden plank, or mutilate some infected because you live in this already established unforgiving world that will do the same to you. And does. Over and over again. And what makes it so interesting and varying is the differentiation between fighting infected and humans. They're two completely different beasts, and you have to approach them separately. Either way, though, it leads to some of the most satisfyingly gory combat I've ever played. Don't try to tell me you didn't enjoy ripping through two straight dudes with insta-kill machetes. You're lying. And Uncharted is notoriously bad for having cliched, overly difficult boss fights, which, of course, this game improves as well. The only pseudo-boss fight in the game is David, which is generally tactical and takes some of the bullshit bullet sponge aspects out of it. While it certainly is not a perfect fight, it is arguably Naughty Dog's best boss fight in recent memory. And for a studio with very few major flaws, this was one that people noticed and they clearly put thought and effort into it, not to mention the story implications that scene has. But of course, the only way to talk about the greatness of The Last of Us is to talk about the story, one of the greatest video game stories ever told. The Last of Us is nothing if not for its story. That's not to take away from the compliments I've given to its gameplay and its smaller environmental discoveries, but there is no Last of Us without its story. I think most people know that by now. I'm not going to go into specifics about the story because you should already generally know what happens, but I want to discuss some of the aspects and specific moments that highlight what ultimately becomes a masterful experience. The real star of the show are the characters. Joel and Ellie are the obvious answer here. Their relationship is dynamic, changing from resentment to father-daughter over the course of the story. And this relationship is a constant callback to the intro. You know, the one that definitely didn't make me cry on each of my first 3 playthroughs. With that context, we understand Joel's perspective on Ellie. And the decision in the hospital makes infinitely more sense with that in mind. But what's most interesting is the development of their relationship and how it changes with where they are and what has happened to them. Because they resent each other at the start, Joel is very stern with Ellie, and very much acts like this is a job and not a personal mission. The biggest leap comes right after the biggest setback for them. After Ellie saves Joel from drowning and shooting the attacker, Joel yells at her for coming back for him and using a gun. Then, like 5 minutes later, when he needs her backup, he gives her a sniper and thanks her for saving him. With that, their relationship begins to come into form and never looks back. And one thing I love most about the game is how it doesn't have to show you everything for you to understand it. For example, it never shows Joel and Ellie talking about Sarah, but Ellie brings her up later in the game, implying that they've talked, which meant that Joel had softened from his crispy little shell and let Ellie in for one small amount of time. But Joel and Ellie are not the only characters. Bill, Tess, David, and Sam and Henry are an incredibly unique and diverse cast. For one, this game set a tone with the use of diversity without making a big deal of it. They imply that Bill is gay, but don't really go into it, and you have to play Left Behind to know that Ellie is gay too. But again, no one gives a fuck because it's the end of the world and people should be able to love or fuck whoever they want. Kinda like 2017. But the characters I want to delve into are Sam and Henry, because their section involves what I believe is one of the greatest cutscenes of all time. We've gone through this whole town of infected and humans to find the radio tower, only for Sam to get bitten. And well, That suicide was the most shocking part of the game for me, leaving me to think about how harsh that world is and how much the relationship between Sam and Henry was the only thing keeping either of them alive. I wonder if that can apply to anyone else we know. But as I mentioned before, The Last of Us is a video game. That fundamental difference changes how a story can be told, especially regarding the pacing between set pieces and significant moments. It's hard to find a good video game story where there aren't extended moments of both intensity and serenity because, unlike a movie, these games have the time to slow down and have moments of exposition. What I think The Last of Us does so well with its pacing is the splitting up of each major aspect of the story into seasons. If you think about it, each season is its own story, and they all connect in the journey to the Firefly's hospital. But each season begins calmly and eventually ramps up to an intense ending with some shocking moment to end it. And the most impressive thing is the transition between the seasons. It's very difficult to follow a scene where a man shoots himself or Joel nearly dies by being impaled, and yet the game just keeps going. And after those crazy scenes, the game has a calm scene every single time. Joel's impalement is followed by Ellie chasing the deer in the woods. And David's near murder, or other action, of Ellie is followed immediately by the infamously beautiful and quiet university set piece. This kind of masterful pacing is so prevalent throughout the story that it's hard to put down. It knows when to be intense and when to hold back, and it fits in those specific moments at the perfect times for maximum effect. And if we're talking about beauty, we have to talk about those goddamn giraffes. That scene is just so incredible. There's really nothing more to say about it than just how perfect that scene is, showing the peace of nature and encapsulating the bond between Joel and Ellie immediately before she goes and is nearly killed. So don't talk shit about giraffes.
We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
And speaking of that near death, another great aspect of the story is how ambiguous and gray it is. As I mentioned with the environments, there is so much detail, but it doesn't force me to feel one specific way. By playing as Joel, you inherently sympathize with him, even more so because of that intro. But by his actions, you begin to realize that he's much more complicated and less likable. But by the end, you still have to decide whether you agree with him on his actions. You don't decide what he does, because saving Ellie is exactly what Joel the character would do. Your decision as the player is whether you support him, or if you are just enabling the extinction of the human race, you monster. It's a tough one, but you make that decision on your own, and I've heard good arguments on both sides of Joel's actions, which just goes to show how the thematic ambiguity makes for wildly different interpretations of the exact same story. Alright, there's a lot more I want to cover in very little time. Lightning round. Writing. Ridiculously good. Some incredibly iconic lines like, "You're treading on some mighty thin ice," and the simple "okay" at the end. And the banter between every character is entertaining and adds to their relationships. Acting. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson are perfectly cast and have fantastic chemistry. Enough said. Graphics. It was the highlight of the PS3. It felt photorealistic back then and it holds up. Music. Iconic theme, perfect score for every beat, 10 out of 10. Other notable moments. I mentioned the Henry suicide is what I feel is one of the greatest cutscenes of all time, but there are others. The Mighty Thin Ice and David's death cutscenes, and basically every other one in the game. And the idea that David wasn't going to kill Ellie but do something worse is horrifying. And finally, I want to talk about the clear impact The Last of Us has had on the gaming industry, especially on other Sony first-party studios in the PS4 generation. Not only is Uncharted 4 very clearly influenced by The Last of Us with some pacing cues and a whole lot of the same interface and technological enhancements, but many of the games that we're seeing as huge successes for Sony are following right in the footsteps of The Last of Us, subtly or not. For one, the specific type of over-the-shoulder third-person action stealth gameplay is everywhere now. I'm not saying that it's all directly based on The Last of Us, but it had an impact. But more specifically, it feels like every game just kinda looks like The Last of Us now. God of War and Days Gone specifically have very similar color palettes and camera angles, and Horizon has a bit of that as well. Days Gone also has the zombie aspect, and it uses the idea that zombies and humans can fight, which we saw in Left Behind. But what I'm really enjoying The Last of Us obviously influenced in gaming is the continued increase in games with good, thoughtful stories. Pretty much every game in Sony's lineup now is doing it, especially Days Gone and God of War. Hell, God of War even copied the father-child aspect. And while I don't think it's possible for them to live up to The Last of Us' story, if they can have a fraction of the success, it's a success for gaming. I'm really excited to see where these games are going to go over the next few years, especially with The Last of Us Part 2 coming out, hopefully in 2019. I personally think this is not a trend that's ending anytime soon. Any game that wants to tell a story can look to The Last of Us for how it can be done right, and that clearly has already begun to happen. I don't see that slowing down. Until the next massive instant classic comes along, it'll be the gold standard for storytelling and how to perfect interactivity while maintaining a tight story in a game. Just be prepared for a buttload of gritty third-person action games. If you can't tell, I love The Last of Us. I hope you can understand why after everything I've said here. I'm hoping this kind of video explains why the game is so good and such a classic without sounding too much like a review. Let me know anything I can do to improve my presentation in the comments, but otherwise, thanks for watching. And let's collectively go into cryosleep so we don't have to wait so long for part 2.